Hey everyone, welcome to my channel. I wanted to talk today about a concept in ecology that is really important to animals. It's really important to animals' lives. It's really important to understanding the threats that animals face. It's really important to understanding the needs that an animal has over the course of its entire life. It's really important if we want to conserve animals for the future. And that concept is migratory connectivity. Migratory connectivity is the relation, the connection across time and landscapes of individuals or populations of a species. Well, that was a bunch of words. What does that mean? Basically, think migration, right? What is migration? Migration is a seasonal movement of individuals or populations. So either an individual can migrate back and forth or an entire group can migrate back and forth. Talk about it either way. But it migrates between two different sites on a sort of regular basis. Maybe it's seasonally, for example, annually, something like that. For an animal to successfully migrate, it has to have both a place to start and a place to go, and then, a place to go back to the starting point. And also, all the steps in between have to be sort of filled in as well. So you can think of it almost like a chain, where each link in the chain represents something. Maybe the first link is the breeding habitat for a bird, and the last link in the chain is the non-breeding, sort of the wintering habitat for a bird. And in between, there are a bunch of links that allow the bird to get from one place to the other and then get back again. And that's where migratory connectivity comes in. Migratory connectivity is basically the study and understanding and principle that links all these steps, that connects the full picture of migration for a given species. Now, as you can imagine, depending on what species we're talking about, the issues that face those species could be very different. I mean, it's going to be very different if we're talking about a bird, say, a western sandpiper that nests, little shorebird, nests up on the edge of the Bering Strait on the western coast of Alaska, and migrates then south to the Pacific coast of Peru. That bird is going to face different challenges, is going to have different needs, all very sort of species specific and all very different from, say, a Chinook salmon that is born up in the headwaters of a river in California. As a young baby fish, traveled down that river all the way to the Pacific Ocean, lived out in the Pacific Ocean for a few years, and then when it was ready, turned around and came back up that same river, back to that breeding ground at that headwater where it was hatched, to then lay its eggs. So that is a migration, right? It's a population level movement from headwaters to ocean, back to headwaters, and repeats again and again and again. But it's a very different migration, and it has very different issues than that western sandpiper, a bird flying from Alaska to Peru and back. And this is one of the sort of subtleties and one of the reasons why connectivity is so important and so complicated. It really is very species specific, and it can span a huge array of issues and a huge array of geographies. I mean, the bird that flies from Alaska to Peru, it travels across international boundaries, it travels across dozens of different habitats, thousands of miles, and making sure that it has everything that it needs on each step of that journey can be a very complicated, very difficult process. Likewise with the salmon. That salmon is going to face all sorts of dangers and threats and challenges. As a baby, as a tiny little baby salmon, after it's hatched as an egg, coming down a river, trying to feed and get bigger, it's going to face even a different set of challenges when it hits the ocean, both sort of physiology, having to change its whole body from a fish that lives in freshwater to a fish that lives in saltwater. But also, the things that you face in the ocean if you're a fish are very different from the things you're going to face in a river as a fish. And also, the things you're going to worry about as a growing or adult fish are going to be very different from the things you have to worry about as a baby fish. And then, of course, those challenges kind of reverse in some ways, and in some ways are sort of uniquely different when that adult salmon swims back up the rivers. It may be concerned with very different issues than the baby salmon it was when it was going down the river, as it travels back up to find its ancestral spawning grounds where it can lay eggs or fertilize eggs if it's a female or a male, and then ultimately die up in those headwaters. And actually, the death of that salmon brings me to another point that's one of the reasons why migratory connectivity is so important. And that is that while migratory connectivity is certainly very important for the species we're talking about, it also has amazing ripple effects to the rest of the ecosystem. Take salmon, for example. Salmon migrating up rivers have incredibly important effects on other aspects of the ecosystems that they migrate up. So for example, very famously from Central California all the way to Alaska, indigenous peoples have waited for and celebrated and relied upon the salmon migration as a food source for thousands of years. Along with humans, grizzly bears rely on salmon. Lots of other animals eat them. Bald eagles eat them. Ravens eat them. Like, there are tons of other animals that gain a very important source of protein, a source of sustenance from having salmon migrate up a river. And salmon is a really great example of this because it goes even farther than just the predators that eat them directly. Because when those salmon go up to the headwaters of their rivers and die, often in very large numbers, salmon runs can be huge. You can have hundreds, maybe even thousands of salmons going up a particular stream and dying in a sort of general particular area of a headwater. Those dying fish release nutrients, their own sort of fish fertilizer basically, into the water, which percolates into the soil, which is then taken up by the surrounding forest. So humans eat the salmon, bears eat the salmon, birds eat the salmon. To a certain extent, the trees eat the salmon. This represents a really important nutrient pulse carried from the ocean all the way up to the headwaters of a forest that then can sort of benefit that forest. And so making sure that a salmon has all the connections that it needs to get from the headwaters where it's born to the ocean where it grows up and then back to the headwaters where it can breed and then ultimately die is incredibly important. And understanding the threats that it might face at each stage of the process and making sure that it has whatever it needs to face and overcome those threats becomes very important. And you can imagine that just like a chain, if any one of those links breaks, it tends to affect the entire system, often very badly, very, very dramatically. So if a dam is erected across that river, while someone might look at it and say, look, the headwaters are fine, the ocean is fine, what's the problem? Well, the connection between them is not fine. And in fact, just one connection. It might be that miles and miles of river are fantastic below this dam. And then miles and miles of river might be fantastic above the dam. But that dam causes a major issue. And so that's where migratory connectivity comes in. It's really looking at each stage, each step in the process, and trying to figure out, okay, is this step doing what it needs to for this particular salmon at this particular stage in its life? And if not, gosh, is there anything we can do about it? So, I mean, for example, to stick with the analogy of salmon and that dam, there are often ways that you can build fish ladders around dams. It gives salmon a process where they can get from sort of stage to stage to stage, sort of a ladder of pools that are separated from each other by a fairly narrow jump, which salmon are excellent doing. Salmon are amazing at jumping up fast-moving waterfalls and rapids. If you've ever seen a video of this, you know what I'm talking about. And if you haven't, by all means, do a quick Google search on videos of salmon traveling upriver. They're incredible, super athletes. And so for a fish ladder, it's basically creating a series of pools that are separated from one another by a small jump that is very easily accomplished by a salmon, and that allows the salmon to find their way around a major barrier like a dam. And so, by looking at the connectivity between each stage and each spot in the chain, we can figure out what needs work and how to fix it and how to figure out a workaround. The study of migratory connectivity also becomes important when those links become kind of weak or separated. And when a chain becomes sort of separated, when some of those links get removed, sometimes that doesn't cause the entire chain to fail, but sometimes it will. And knowing when that's going to happen is really important. An example of this from very recently, from sort of an ongoing issue, is the oil spill that happened in Huntington Beach, California. So again, going back to that Western sandpiper example, going back to my bird. A bird that raised its babies in Alaska, got its babies out, was successful, raised independent young, and is now ready to migrate, starts heading south. You can imagine a couple thousand years ago, this bird, as it headed south, had lots of options on where to stop and where to forage. There was tons of open natural landscapes of just the kind that it needed, with the food resources that it needed and the sheltering spots that it needed, everything that it needed to get from Alaska all the way down to Peru. Because remember, a bird is not flying from Alaska to Peru in one fell swoop. It needs stopovers. It needs places to rest. It needs places to refuel. Migration is exhausting. So a couple thousand years ago, it had tons of choices for where those spots could be. But fast forward to now, it's got a lot fewer choices. Humans really like to live on coasts. Coasts are beautiful. Coasts are amazing. And so we live on coasts. We've changed a lot of coasts. And so a lot of the wetlands, a lot of the marshes, a lot of the tidal habitats that maybe that Western sandpiper needs to get from Alaska to Peru have been changed, have sometimes been destroyed. Which means that those last places that do remain become that much more important. The fewer links in this chain you have, or the wider those sort of spots are from each other, the more important each of them becomes. And that's where, if you have an oil spill, for example, right, going to this oil spill off of Huntington Beach, California, when it affects a marsh, when it affects one of those remaining links in that chain, it can become a huge problem for migratory connectivity, because it may very well represent the removal of one of those stepping stones, one of those links in the chain that a bird needs to get from point A to point B. So as we've sort of stretched the system, as we've removed many steps in the process, the remaining steps become that much more important. And when those are removed, it can sort of get closer and closer to being genuinely catastrophic. Fortunately, the oil spill prevention and oil spread prevention measures that have been used around Southern California have so far been successful at mostly preventing the damage from oil getting into some of the marshes that are right there on the Southern California coast. Some definitely has gotten in. There have definitely been birds that have been affected by it, but it hasn't been nearly as bad as it might have been. If you're curious about this subject and the Huntington Beach oil spill, I did actually make a video about this, and I will link it in the description below. So migratory connectivity is a way of looking at all these complicated issues, of looking at the geography of huge distances, international boundaries, like I said, many countries, many habitats, looking at the threats that the various stages might pose to a migratory species, understanding that migratory species and understanding all the components of its individual lifespan, understanding all the effects that that species might have on its surrounding ecosystem, all are sort of wrapped up into this idea of migratory connectivity. And it's one of the reasons why it's so important in ecology and conservation and habitat restoration. It certainly plays a big role in the work that I do and the projects that I fund, because a lot of them, they're stream and river focused projects. And many of them are looking at salmon, for example, and other anadromous fish that spends part of their time in freshwater, move out to saltwater, and then go back to freshwater. And understanding what issues are they facing and how do we make their migrations easier, possible, more successful. So, hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you very much for the view. Please subscribe to the channel. Keep it growing. And until next time, enjoy the natural world.